Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor. And today, before we start our episode, I'd like to ask you guys to like, share, and subscribe if you like what we're doing here at Plotlines. And please join our Discord if you want to join in conversations. And for today's episode, I have His Grace, Bishop Strickland, Bishop of the Diocese of Tyler, Texas. Welcome, Bishop Strickland.
Thanks, Connor.
As I said earlier, it's really an honor to have you on, and thank you for taking your time or taking time out of your day to talk to us.
Sure, glad to do it.
So I want to sort of start off by sort of getting to know you a little bit. So what drew you to devotion into the Catholic, into your Catholic faith?
Well, I'd have to credit my family for that. I grew up, I'm a cradle Catholic, as we say, baptized. I think I was 10 days old when I was baptized back in 1958. And so growing up in that family, being Catholic was always seen as the greatest blessing that we had. I was number 6 of 7 kids. 6 of us grew up together. I had one infant brother who died as an infant that would have been just older than me. 6 of us grew up together. So being Catholic, I think it was shared with us that that was a great blessing and that we were blessed to be Catholic, to have the true faith that Christ established. And so from my earliest memories, it was just being Catholic was great.
Yeah. So what made you know that you had a calling to the priesthood?
Well, I'd say 8 years of seminary formation. I went in the seminary at 18, and I definitely didn't know that I had a calling at that point, but I knew that I wanted to check it out. As I told my older sister, I remember we were at a basketball game and I just told her, and I said, it was like there was a monkey on my back and I wanted to check it out. So went in the seminary at 18, and it always just felt like the right place for me to be. Not always easy. And I did a lot of growing and understanding the Catholic faith and the complexities and the history of the church, which I have to admit, at 18, when I first entered the seminary, there was so much I had to learn, but kept learning and growing. And it just felt like I feel very blessed that at 18, I really got on the path for the rest of my life.
Wow. Yeah, that's really cool. So you were born and raised in Texas, right?
Correct. Born in
And
Fredericksburg, which is in the Archdiocese of San Antonio. And then we moved here to East Texas, the Texarkana area, which is right up in the northeastern corner of Texas. Texarkana is Texas and Arkansas. The town is on the border of the 2 states. And so I grew up in a little town called Atlanta, about 20 miles from Texarkana. And so grew up on 100 acres out in the country, cows and horses, and all of that country life that I have to admit I didn't appreciate that much as a kid. I mean, it was the only thing I knew, but looking back, I think there were a lot of advantages to growing up that way.
yeah, and the Diocese of Tyler didn't exist either, isn't that correct?
Correct. When I went in the seminary, this area was part of the Diocese of Dallas. Actually, when I was ordained, it was still part of the Diocese of Dallas. I was ordained in 1985, and a year and a half later, the Diocese of Tyler was established. So I was here in the diocese from the very beginning.
Wow. And you became its vocations director, am I right?
Correct. About a month after the diocese started, I was the first vocation director.
What did that job really look like? Was there a lot of interest in the priesthood at that time?
Fair amount. I think, of course, we started with no seminarians. I think we had probably about 5, maybe a few more than that. Some of men that I worked with as vocation director are presently priests of the diocese. So we had some good success in those early years. I think there's something attractive and interesting about joining a new diocese. And we had men from the area, but also men from other parts of Texas and other parts of the country that joined us as seminarians.
Yeah, you must have had a lot of sort of influence on sort of the diocese, even until becoming bishop, because you were vocations director and then you became bishop.
Yeah, and I've worked closely with all three of the first, second, and third bishop of Tyler. Yeah, I've been blessed to be very much a part of the development of the diocese. Three very different predecessors. The first bishop of Tyler, Bishop Charles Herzig, sadly only lived about 4 years after his ordination. He had lung cancer and died in 1991. He'd only been ordained bishop in 1987, so we didn't have him very long.
Mm-hmm.
And then Bishop Carmody was with us for about 10 years, Bishop Edmund Carmody, and then Bishop Alvaro Corrada was with us for another 10 years. And now I've been bishop for about 10 years. The diocese is 35 years old. So,
wow. So how did you become bishop?
Well, got a call from the nuncio, and Pope Benedict was Pope at that time. September 14th, I always remember it was the feast of the Triumph of the Cross. That was significant for me. That's when I got the phone call. And there is a cross to answering the call of priesthood or being a bishop, especially in the church today. But also the announcement, the official announcement, there's usually a couple of weeks. And it was announced on the Feast of the Archangels, September 29th. So I figured those were two great days for me to get the phone call on the Feast of the Triumph of the Cross, and then to have it announced on the Feast of the Archangels. Pretty good days.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Was that a hard sort of yes to give?
Not really. Honestly, if I'd known what the future would hold, it might have been harder. But you make these commitments without knowing the future. It's kind of like getting married, for better, for worse, and sickness and in health. So I didn't find it that hard, and it wasn't totally surprising. Having been here as I was and working as administrator and then delegate of the administrator, there were rumors that it might be me. And then, I remember I have two sisters that live in the diocese. One lived in the diocese at that point. Another has since moved into the diocese, my oldest sister. And she would tell people, oh, they don't make, a priest that's in the diocese the bishop, which isn't the norm, but,
Yeah.
That's what they did in my case. So it's certainly had its challenges, but it's been a blessing also for me personally, and hopefully for the people of the diocese. I think as a small rural diocese, I think there's a special advantage that people knew who I was and I knew who they were, because it is, every diocese I'm sure is unique in itself, but there are some unique qualities of Catholic East Texas, where less than 10% of the population. So we're not in the majority. It's a small kind of mission church. And I think to have grown up in that and to know that has been an advantage to me.
Yeah. Well, I definitely can't speak for your diocese, but for people looking to you from outside your diocese, I think we can all say that we're grateful for your witness and you being the bishop where you are.
And thank you.
Word from our affiliate, Bishop Sheen Rosaries. You've probably worn through the chain of your cheap plastic rosary. Other rosaries simply can't stand up to the wear and tear of everyday life. Bishop Sheen rosaries are made of solid metal beads and paracord to withstand any condition and are backed with a lifetime warranty. Upgrade your rosary to a Bishop Sheen rosary made to fit your lifestyle or buy one for a friend. Each rosary sold supplies 2 weeks of food for a school kid in Uganda. You use the exclusive link down below to help support our efforts here at Plotlines. The link will take you to sheenrosaries.com. Be sure to use the code Plotlines10.
So who are your role models, or who were your role models when you were sort of either in seminary or even before then, or when you were a young priest, or just now as a bishop?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Those role models have certainly evolved as my work and my responsibilities have evolved. As a young priest, I knew some good priests in the seminary, had some good formation faculty that were role models for me. And then as I progressed, honestly, as bishop, a lot of my role models are saints, especially the martyr bishops through the centuries, the bishops that have been willing to lay down their lives for the deposit of faith, for the truth of Christ. And it's happened, I mean, I don't want to volunteer to be a martyr, but I think we need to have that kind of strength as bishops. St. John Fisher is one of my favorites. St. Athanasius, who was, in the early church in the 4th century, I think, and not a martyr, but in some ways a white martyr. And I think many of the good bishops through the centuries have been what we would call white martyrs. They may not have been killed, but they've certainly sacrificed. And I think that's what we're called to do, especially in the church today, to guard the deposit of faith, which is one of the promises that a bishop makes, and to truly embrace the fullness of our Catholic faith with joy and with vigor and with clarity. And that's certainly what I try to do. And there are certainly bishops in the world and in the US today that I find as inspirations, and just try to do my best to represent the truth of Christ, which really is a joyful and glorious message of hope for humanity. I think we tend to think, even within the Catholic community, like I said, maybe there's some advantages to being a minority Catholic community. We don't live in East Texas as if the Catholic Church is this big major force in everything in the area. But in some ways, I think that highlights that we're not about this world. We are called to support the journey to everlasting life, for the salvation of souls. And I think that perspective is very important in the church today. It's easy to kind of get bogged down in the fixing this world, and we certainly are called to be good stewards of the resources we're given, to care for the earth, to care for all of humanity, but always with that in the context of seeking the salvation of souls, seeking everlasting life. And I think there's a tendency in the church and certainly in the world to focus so much on this world that we forget the kingdom that we're built for.
Yeah, indeed. That's very true. You mentioned St. John Fisher. I was thinking about him when you were talking about, sort of the marriage of being a bishop and accepting a diocese. I know that's something that he would probably how he described, or how he would describe that relationship. But and we also talked about how it's a cross to bear to be a bishop. What is the greatest difficulty in your eyes for a bishop in America today?
Well, I think it's encountering a culture that certainly affects the church as well. A culture of confusion, a culture of relativism, a culture of humanism rather than Catholicism, rather than faith, rather than Christ, King of the universe. It's more sort of, as I said, I guess one way I would say, Connor, to focus is, I think we have a very horizontal focus in culture today, just in general. People are worried about the world and worried about what they're going to accomplish in worldly terms, building wealth and getting, more influence and more power in this world. But I think especially in the church and really for humanity, I mean, Christ came to save humanity. He established the church as an instrument of that salvation, but it's not just about the church, he's about all of humanity. And I think when he says all power in heaven and on earth has been given to him by the Father as God's divine Son, that I think all power in the world needs to hear that and needs to, as certainly in the church, a bishop has a lot of authority and a lot of power in that sense. And I think we need to wield that authority and power with really a good dose of trepidation, of fear and trembling, of humility, and recognizing, I'm just a sinful man that is going to make mistakes, and to approach it with humility, always seeking the will of God, seeking that light of Christ to guide us. So, I think that really, in all of that context, it's challenging to be a bishop today, because even the church says sometimes really directs us more to be more managers of what's going on in the world, rather than always ourselves as men of prayer being lifted to the eternal perspective that Christ brings us. I mean, just today we're celebrating what's become the memorial of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. And in the first reading, beautiful reading from John's letter, talking about love, and God is love. And it's our challenge as church, and for me as a bishop, to really help the members of the church and help the world to remember what real love is. And that's probably one of our greatest confusions in this time. Love is so many times translated as based on feelings that come and go, but the classical definition of love is to will the good of the other. And those are very concrete, measurable, a very concrete and measurable focus. To will, to really choose, to make decisions, to will the good, what is good for this person. And again, in Christ's perspective, in a seeking everlasting life, seeking what we're built for. We come from God, we're called to return to God. And in that context, it's a very challenging time to be a bishop in the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I don't think people even know what good is most of the time. It's sort of to will the good for somebody, requires you to know what good is, and
Yeah.
people don't know much of anything these days.
Yeah.
Which,
And absolutely, Connor. And the good is bound up with what is true. Christ is truth incarnate, and it all gets woven together. The good, the true, the beautiful, that is what fulfills us, because that's God. I mean, God is love. Built into that is that God is all goodness, all beauty, all truth. And, those kind of philosophical underpinnings, even within the church, are often so far from people's perspective, because frankly, for my lifetime, I mean, I'm a lot older than you, I can see. And for my lifetime, we've dropped the ball on solid catechesis. And that really began even before I was born, but it certainly has been the norm, and more education has been weak. It doesn't mean that great people haven't developed and learned and embraced the faith. I mean, I often say, I was just at a conference this past weekend, and some of the converts are our best Catholics today, because as an adult, or maybe someone in their late teens, but approaching adulthood, someone that really intentionally says, I'm going to study and I'm going to embrace this Catholic faith. The converts tend to be people that have really studied, read the fathers, read the scriptures, read the catechism, read the magisterial teachings of the church, much more than a lot of us cradle Catholics. I mean, my blessing was to go to the seminary because part of the curriculum was to study a lot of that, to be formed as a priest. But I'm 63 years old, most men and women my age that may have been faithful Catholics all of their lives, going to Mass, the catechesis just wasn't there. A lot of them have grown. I mean, certainly there are cradle Catholics that have become very solid, very strong, kind of self-catechized Catholics. But and really that's sort of where we are, which I think we need to pay attention to. Whether convert or deeply committed Catholic today, most of that happens with self-catechesis, with deciding, I want to really learn what my faith is about. And if you haven't done that, that we haven't had a good system of catechizing children and then continuing that catechesis. I mean, we should all be lifelong learners as Catholics, because the wonders of our faith and the wonder of God, Father, Son, and Spirit, the wonder of God's incarnate Son, Jesus Christ, we're never going to get to the bottom of those mysteries and the depth of that truth. So it should be a lifelong journey. And I think for most people who are truly committed Catholics, that's what it is. They're reading, they're praying, they're continuing to learn and to grow. And that's certainly what I try to do. I've still got a lot to learn.
Yeah. I'm a cradle Catholic, and I would say that the biggest, first of all, I had to learn, I had to decide that I had to learn what was going on. And really what saved me only, from, falling away from the church, I would say almost is instinct. I mean, really it's grace, but it feels like instinct in the moment. It's like your instincts keep you from falling away, but some people don't have that as grained, is, really inside them. And converts, I feel like the hardest thing for them is like finding the truth almost, because there's so much confusion even within the church that catechesis is kind of like a minefield. Trying not to get blown up when you're sort of searching, and then converts probably run into this thing where they might get discouraged because they've worked so hard, and then they've learned something, and then then there's conflicting narratives going on, and then they're like, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. And I've seen a lot of people that have been somewhere, I guess in some ways, we're all on that journey of continuing to learn. And I think as you're talking, Connor, what occurs to me is our faith is very incarnational. I mean, the Son of God, the eternal Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, became a man, became incarnate. And I think that tells us that we have to approach the faith in a very incarnate way. And the sacraments, or the beauty of the sacraments, is that they speak to our incarnate reality. They speak to us as bodily beings that experience water and experience oil and experience smells and tastes and all of those senses. Jesus Christ has given us those because he knows what it's like to smell things and to taste things and to feel things. He's fully God, fully man. And I think that's one thing that the whole experience of online masses and Zoom meetings and all of that, certainly like we're doing right now, there's a value to it. Mm-hmm. But I think it hopefully just in anthropology, and certainly as people of faith, it reminds us that these electronic communications, as helpful as they can be in their place, are not a substitute for sitting down and being with people And certainly the Mass is about that. It's going to God to worship together, whether it's a huge congregation or a very small congregation. It needs to be going to God to worship together. And I think that the whole experience with COVID and some of the things that we've gone through in the past couple of years, hopefully as people of faith, it just reminds us there's no substitute for coming to the house of God, to a cathedral, a church, a basilica, a small chapel, a huge building, a small building, whatever the nature of that space and that building, that its purpose is to be a house of prayer, the house of God. And even within the church, I mean, I think we need to continue to remember, as I was talking earlier, the vertical and the horizontal dimensions of our faith really should always intersect in the liturgy. The horizontal coming together should give us the vertical focus on God. And, I think the liturgy sometimes has failed to do that in my lifetime. And it, really, I mean, we talk a lot about the ordinary form or the extraordinary form. That was the language used for a while. Now it's the Novus Ordo or the Latin Mass. Whatever form, we need to remember the very nature of the liturgy is it lifts us to God. It's a vertical movement. It should be unlike anything else we do during that day or during that week, if depending on the context of how often we go to celebrate the Eucharistic liturgy, the Mass. And I think we've got to work to make sure it is that transcendent calling us up to God. Where, again, that's what we're built for. We're built to return to God. And naturally, in history, even pre-Christian, the idea that heaven is up, hell is down, we're here in between. We've got to make a choice to go up or down. I mean, that's basic to humanity. And I think we need to pay attention to that and to celebrate that and to glory in what the Mass can be and how it calls us to God.
Yeah, it's very innate, especially like you said about the, heaven is up and hell is down, even in pagan cultures such as Greek myth or Norse myth. That's the same structure, even if it's laid out differently or different words for it. Also, I wanted to say something about sort of the electronic, the over, Zoom over, live streams, that sort of thing. It really touches the intellect, but that's all it can do, because it only touches your intellect if your intellect is open to being touched. So otherwise you lose out on all the other senses that make you human, and that is another reason why it makes you don't gain really spiritually, I don't think, or in any real capacity by just watching something online.
Yeah.
You have to really experience everything fully present.
Yeah, I agree, Connor. And the word that comes to mind as you're talking is disembodied. I mean, right now we are disembodied heads talking to each other. And it is a way of communicating, and it can begin that relationship. I mean, we've never met, and this is a great way, better than just talking on the phone, but not as good as being in person. And I think we just have to acknowledge that and to always remind ourselves, especially when it comes to worshiping God, it's not just an intellect thing. It's certainly the intellect is involved, but it is embodied and not disembodied. And I think we need to really pay attention to that. And the elements of the music and the incense and the candles and everything that becomes a part of that experience, even the smells of being in, I've had the chance to celebrate Mass just recently in the National Shrine, the Basilica there in Washington, D.C., the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception. It just, even somebody who doesn't believe in God, it does something to you to hear the reverberation of the sound, to see the beautiful artwork. It just lifts you up. And I think that that's essential to really embody mind and spirit in an embodied way to worship and to learn and to grow. That we need to pay attention to, even beyond the issue of faith. I think the schools have learned that children just doing things on a computer is not a substitute for being in a classroom and interacting with each other and interacting with the teacher and doing all the human things that go with being in a school classroom, as opposed to, talking to a screen.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned the celebrating the extraordinary form, or the traditional Latin Mass. Now, you first celebrated the traditional Latin Mass just recently, or within a few years, right?
Yeah, 2020, the Feast of Corpus Christi of 2020, in the traditional calendar, the whole Corpus Christi Thursday basically was the first time I ever celebrated a Latin Mass. And it took me about 6 months because I really had no exposure to it. It wasn't something that I had known or ever experienced, really. I'd seen little clips of it in movies and things, but as far as really experiencing a Latin Mass. So for 6 months, a great young priest of our diocese helped me to just go through and practice. And I'm still, as I tell people, a pre-neophyte with the Latin Mass. And, I love what's called the Novus Ordo as well. And I guess what I try to emphasize to the people in the diocese is, let's seek Christ. Let's enter into worship of God, Father, Son, and Spirit. Let us seek Christ through his word, through the Eucharist, and celebrate that opportunity through the worship of the Mass to actually encounter God in a very corporeal, his body and blood, soul and divinity, in a very embodied way, to encounter God at Mass. So whatever form gets you there and takes you there should be reverent and respectful and always focused on where we're going. And I think that's one thing that we need to remind ourselves of, is to constantly, as a priest, as a bishop, I need to approach celebrating the Mass with a focus on where we're headed and who we are worshiping. It's not just a gathering of people, but it's a gathering of people to turn to God and to pray and worship and be reminded of where we came from, of what's embedded in us as those created in the image and likeness of God. So all of that, I think, is the effect of good liturgy, of bringing us really more into ourselves and more into God and being the children of God.
Yeah. That has your celebration of the traditional Latin Mass affected your celebrations in the Novus Ordo as well?
Absolutely. I think it's helped me to be more reverent and more focused. I think we have to be careful about, mixing it all together. We need to follow the Novus Ordo rubrics or the Latin Mass rubrics, but certainly the tone of the Latin Mass, what I've said many times in just my own attempt to understand all of this and to make it part of me and who I am and how I approach worshiping God. I see the Novus Ordo, which I grew up with, which I still continue to celebrate. It's like the basic melody of Christ is there, and we're moving toward him if we're approaching that liturgy properly, through word and through all the imagery of the Eucharistic altar, the sacrifice of his love. So the Novus Ordo is like the melody line, just simplified and less elaborate. But then the Latin Mass, let's say a high Latin Mass, is the full-blown symphony orchestra proclaiming the glory of Father, Son, and Spirit, offering the Son to the Father in the Spirit, just a full-blown, symphony orchestra that, and I think to me that expresses the difference. It's the same melody, it's the same song of Christ, but in the Novus Ordo, much simpler, and in the Latin Mass, much richer, much more elaborate. Sometimes that the elaborate nature of the Mass is off-putting to people, but I think I see, and like I said, the main thing for me is remembering what the focus is, where we're headed. It's not about me as celebrant. It's not about the congregation. It's not a conversation between celebrant and congregation, but it's a conversation with God, with all of us. And the presider, the priest that's celebrating the Mass, it's our job to sort of lead the flock deeper into the heart of Christ, deeper into the life of Father, Son, and Spirit. And certainly, I believe that any liturgy that is validly celebrated and properly celebrated, I mean, it's Christ working through the Mass. And so any of the liturgies can and should lead us to God. But with, I guess, one thing that I would say with the Latin Mass, just my limited experience of it, one thing that really struck me as I was learning about it is that everything is pointing to Christ. Everything, I mean, even the way the priest holds his hands and the way they hold their bodies, they bow or they lean here, all of it is pointing to Christ. And certainly the Novus Ordo can and should do that, but you kind of have to work at it more as celebrant and as congregation, because I think there are ways that it can be forgotten that this is about Christ and the proclamation of the word. I mean, the lectionary is more extensive in the Novus Ordo. I mean, there are just more readings, more samplings of various parts of the Bible. And I think in that, we need to remind ourselves that's not just more, a greater sampling of the Word of God, but it's Christ. I mean, Christ is the Word. The Catechism says that very clearly, that all of Scripture is about Christ. And I think we continue, I know I continue to learn that more and more as I grow in faith, to remember that the Old Testament is always speaking of Christ in language that's very different and an imagery that you really have to kind of tune in to recognize. But from Genesis to Revelation, the Bible, sacred scripture, is all about the divine word, the eternal word, which is Jesus Christ incarnate among us. And I think we need to remind ourselves of that. And as we're hearing the word proclaimed, to really set our hearts on listening to Christ and hearing his presence, even in Old Testament prophets, or sometimes those readings from like the book of Numbers that it's like, what are they talking about? This is strange to us. But to really try to learn more and to put it more into the whole context of the Hebrew scriptures, that, I mean, what the Hebrew story is from our perspective is looking to the Messiah, looking to the Christ, the anointed of God. We have him, he has come, and we celebrate him in the New Testament, but looking at the Old Testament is always pointing to him. I think you have to kind of work at that in the Novus Ordo, but you can certainly bring that focus.
Yeah. It makes me think why people like Dr. Scott Hahn and other sort of biblical scholars are so popular these days. And so
Dr. Brant Petrie, I love some of his writings. And there's some great scholars that are really helping us to do that.
Yeah. How do you ensure, or how do you pursue liturgies to be done as they're meant to be done, the way you're talking about it.
Well, I think it starts with prayer for all of us to develop a deeper relationship with God, Father, Son, and Spirit, to know Christ more deeply. If we know him as a person in our lives, as incarnate and real, then I think that is the biggest help to approaching the liturgy. And certainly for me as a celebrant of the Mass, to then pay attention to what's happening in the liturgy. When we gather, what are we doing? When we make that sign of the cross, we're sort of beginning that sacred time of entering into the liturgy. And we need to remind ourselves of that, paying attention to the rubrics and not being, legalistic rubricist and mechanical about it, but paying attention and being guided and recognizing that if we really listen to those directives for the priest bows now, or he makes the sign of the cross, or those things. I mean, one of the things in the contrast between the two different styles of liturgy is, there are many more genuflections in the Latin Mass than in the Novus Ordo. But paying attention to those, why are we genuflecting? Because primarily the genuflection is a sign that we're recognizing the presence of Christ as we come in before the tabernacle. If it's right there behind the altar, we genuflect. And I think those genuflections, though they're reduced, can hopefully have the same impact and pay attention to why are we genuflecting at this moment. And I think that's the kind of thing that every priest needs to, as you do something. I mean, I've been a priest for 37 years. And it's easy to kind of get accustomed to things. It's just routine. It's just the way you do it. But I think, again, to go back to prayer, and if you're coming to it prayerfully, then to recognize, how can I be more reverent? How can I be more focused on Christ? How can I help this congregation to focus more on Christ? Following the rubrics and not making things up on our own, but doing the rubrics in a spirit of seeking a deeper relationship with Christ.
Yeah. It seems to me, I don't know if it has anything to do with the lessening of genuflection to begin with, but it seems to me that the lay people don't necessarily, maybe more on the, not the old necessarily, but maybe like between 40 and 60, maybe the ages, don't necessarily, at least the more casual Catholics, don't really know when they're supposed to genuflect if they're in the presence of the Eucharist, if they're in the presence of the tabernacle. It seems to me that that's been lessened.
Yeah, well, I think that goes back to the catechesis issues, that people just haven't learned deeply even how to approach the Mass. So that's probably one of the areas that we need to catechize the most, is just, how do you pray at Mass? What's the focus? Why are you doing these things? Why are we standing? Why are we kneeling? Why are we sitting? Why are we making these motions? And to help people learn how to pray the Mass is probably one of the main ways we need to improve our catechesis.
Yeah. Now, what advice do you have for those young men discerning the priesthood, and especially those who feel a draw towards the Latin Mass? It seems that that might be a more difficult thing for them.
Yeah, well, certainly there's a lot of controversy surrounding the Latin Mass at this time. I really, in my experience, I think that the young people drawn to that, and it is a lot of young people, I think they're hungry for the supernatural, the reverent, the awe-inspiring elements of that. And I would encourage a young man, considering priesthood, not to let go of that, but to recognize that, bring that into whatever Mass they participate in. And if the Mass that's being celebrated, Novus Ordo, is is really not nurturing that. I know that can be frustrating, and sometimes that's the case. But as I've talked to people, sometimes, I mean, like in my experience growing up as a kid in rural East Texas, I mean, there weren't a lot of options. But I think you can bring that spirit of reverence and that spirit that maybe makes the Latin Mass attractive. I would encourage young men considering priesthood to bring that into whatever Mass is being offered, and to know it's all about Jesus Christ. And I think the deeper their relationship with Christ is, the more that can be nurtured. And he's there in whatever form. The word, he is the word being proclaimed, and he is who comes in the bread and wine that's consecrated. If it's truly a Catholic Mass, we believe that the words of consecration in Latin and English and Spanish and whatever language, the words of consecration make transubstantiation happen. And certainly we hope that the priest is doing that very reverently. But the church learned in the early centuries that Christ is acting through the sacraments. Christ is acting, I mean, in persona Christi, we say. And that's why the words of consecration are spoken in the first person. This is my body. And I think we really need to pay attention to that Christ is acting in the Mass, even if the priest is really not helping us in the way he's celebrating. We need to pray for the priest, and we need to, I know in my own experience, the faith and the piety of the faithful can inspire the priest to be a little more focused and a little more reverent and a little more aware of what we're doing. We can help each other.
Yeah. I thank you. I appreciate that that advice for those. I think all those young men out there too will appreciate that advice. On a sort of more on an American scale, on the whole of American Catholicism, would you say it's in a dangerous state at the moment?
Well, I would say there are dangerous elements that we need to be aware of. Not just in America, but really throughout the church, and it affects the church in the United States for sure. But we need to be very clear about the truth. And, I was just reading an article today, some bishops, not in the United States, but in another country, saying, oh, well, this teaching needs to change and that teaching needs to change. And the truth doesn't change. And we believe that Christ is truth incarnate, and his church is the font of truth. So I think when you start hearing that, oh, this teaching needs to change, that is dangerous. And I think it should alarm us to say, wait a minute, a deepening understanding, of course. I mean, I don't claim to it's a mystery that none of us will understand the fullness of God and the fullness of his Son, the power of the Spirit, in our lives, in our limited understanding as human beings. But to say it needs to change, that I think is more about us, and we need to change rather than saying truth needs to change, because truth isn't going to change. Jesus Christ is the face of truth, and he's not one Christ yesterday and one Christ tomorrow. He is yesterday, today, and forever the same Christ. And I think we need to, in the United States and really throughout the church, throughout the world, we just need to remember that and really reject some of the confusion and just say, let's understand who Christ is and the truth that he lived, died, and rose to share with us what that truth is.
Yeah. So you say we need to sort of think about this differently. The truth is always going to be the truth, no matter what you want. So how do you think Americans need to be different or need to act differently from how we are acting now?
Well, I'll put myself first in line, but I think we need a deeper humility. a humility to understand we don't have it all figured out. And if we're saying truth needs to change, I need to look in the mirror and say, what do I need to change to adapt to the truth that was there before I was born and was there at the dawn of creation? I think we need to really be more humble. And like I said, I'll get first in line for a deeper humility and understanding that we're approaching eternal truths that aren't going to change, that haven't changed and are not going to. And we need to look at, what do I need to do differently to understand this and help others understand it more deeply?
Yeah. On a more local level, is Catholicism flourishing in Texas?
I believe it is. Texas is an area that the population's growing. It's not like, some of what have been very large dioceses and archdioceses in the Northeast. They're closing parishes. There are a lot of changes in the demographics. I think Texas is on a more of a growth cycle, but we've got to pay attention and recognize where we can end up, as things cycle through. We need to be aware that, we're no better people necessarily than the people in any other part of the nation where maybe churches are closing. And we need to pay attention to that to see any caution signs that we need to be aware of.
No.
I'm sorry, Connor, but I'm kind of running out of time.
Okay.
I need to wrap it up.
Yeah, can I ask one more question?
Sure.
Okay. What are the strengths and weaknesses that you see in the culture of Texas?
I think the strength is a lot of, frankly, rural communities. Cities are challenging for all kinds of reasons because, I think in very simple, basic terms, they're more removed from direct contact with the created world. In cities, it's concrete, it's a lot of electronics, it's all, it's sort of a man-made world. That's what a city is. And to get out into the countryside, I think there's something nurturing about that for just being human. And so I think that's an advantage. Texas is a big state and there's a lot of rural area, a lot of countryside. And I think that's an advantage that we need to pay attention to and to be aware that, like we were talking about, we're embodied people. We need the earth. We need the plants. We need to be part of creation because we are part of creation. In the artificial world that can be what a city is something that makes it more challenging to remember we're part of creation. We didn't build this. We didn't build our bodies. God did. And I think that's a basic element of Texas that is still, just because it's such a vast area, is a blessing for us.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Bishop Strickland, for coming on, and have everyone please have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thanks, Connor. God bless.
God bless.